Okay. Um, so here we are, 8 weeks on studying the book of Romans. Um, I'm gonna tonight is gonna be kind of an introduction of sorts to the book itself. But let's start with just sort of have you read the book of Romans? Have you studied the book of Romans? Where are you in this already? The Romans is such a powerful, but it's also popular book of the Bible that you may have already studied this and you already have a kind of a starting place and some things that are in your mind about this book. So where are you on the book of Romans as we start?
I've never studied it specifically, but through all the years working in the church, I've always loved when we use it in the lectionary.
Yeah, absolutely. It comes up often because it's really important, really valuable, especially Reformation Sunday. It's Romans that offers the kind of the juice behind the Reformation, and Martin Luther's nailing the 95 Theses on the door. So we get a heavy dose of Romans, no matter what year of the lectionary we're in. Any other thoughts on the book of Romans that you are sort of starting with?
That's pretty central to our religion.
Yeah,
It's pretty central to our religion. It's probably the most important book of the Bible.
That's a fair statement. I mean, aside from the Gospels themselves, Romans stands right up there. And for some, it may even be more important than the Gospels because it helps us understand what the Gospels are telling us about Jesus. So yeah, this is a real important book in the whole Bible. Is there anything else? And then we'll go ahead and move on here.
I was wondering if you could refresh my memory of what years Paul was actually alive.
So I'm gonna talk a little bit about Paul in this introductory. But Paul would have. My recollection is that Paul would have died somewhere in the late 60s, I think.
Late 60s.
Maybe the 70s, maybe 70s.
Wasn't this book written in 68? In 68 was this book written? I don't know.
Romans was 57.
Oh, 57. Okay.
I mean, give or take. There's no hard, fast dating on these things. We're within a year or two. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So, and Romans was at the latter part of his time of writing. He did have some writings afterwards. We're going to talk about that. But I would think after it's unclear. We kind of lose track of Paul after the writings, and then he's presumed to have been beheaded. But even that's not entirely clear. So. Right. Well, let's go ahead and dive in a little further here. Is there a message or a phrase? This is our icebreaker for tonight. A message or a phrase that you would say changed your life. Now, this doesn't have to be from the book of Romans. This is just any message or phrase. And the reason this is our icebreaker is because the book of Romans is chock full of messages and phrases like this, that for many people, the book of Romans changed their life. But is there a message or a phrase that you would say changed your life? I'll give you a chance to think on that, because that might be one of these questions that you kind of have to think on first. Is there a message or phrase that changed your life?
Well, I know a lot of my church family know. For me, it's let go and let God.
Yeah, you have mentioned that. That's true.
Yes,
yeah,
that's my big one.
She's a staple on her head.
I don't know.
I wouldn't say that this changed my life, but in going through Diane's things after she passed away, in her wallet, I found a piece of paper that said on it, people will not remember what you said, people will not remember what you did, but they will always remember how you made them feel.
yeah,
And that stuck with me.
yeah. That's a good one. Anything else?
I think the one phrase that sticks with me all the time is it's just a very short one. It says, God created, period. You know?
Yeah. Well, my favorite Bible verse, that is life-changing in the sense that it shapes my theology, is the 1 John 4, verse 8, 3 words, God is love. Those 3 words, that sentence completely reorients for me my own sort of theology and ethic about it. Because if God is love, and not that God is a God who commands us to love, that changes everything. Now, being made in the image of God means that we're made in the image of this triune God, and made in the image of God means we're made for the purpose of love. It just sort of, the dominoes fall right into place for me, like as if that's the first domino that falls, and then everything else sort of topples in that direction. All right. So that's a good icebreaker for us to kind of dive in, and because the book of Romans is chock full of these lines that have dramatically changed the course of theology, have dramatically changed many people's lives, and the power of some of the words that Paul wrote. These are some of the most powerful words, just sort of sentences and words strung together in the Bible, and they have shaped people's lives. And even though we didn't mention anything from Paul's letter to the Romans, that book is full of them. And you might end up after this study, any of us might end up after the study, sort of finding something that we land on that is going to help shape us in the future. So that's why it's a good icebreaker here. So let's talk a little bit about this. Background now. Today is sort of an introduction. It's kind of a background kind of thing. So some key points here. And Paul was writing the book of Romans around, as I said earlier, kind of, we can't pinpoint down to a day or anything like that. So we're within a year or so, around AD 57. He's writing to Christians who are in the church in Rome. And Paul had never visited Rome. He was writing. At the time in which he's writing, he had not yet visited this church. Paul's letters offer a raw, firsthand account of his transformation from a relentless persecutor. I'm trying to give a background of Paul right now, not so much the book of Romans. And so we're going to kind of backdoor into Romans by sort of talking about Paul and where Romans fits in Paul's letters and in Paul's journeys and Paul's ministry. So Paul's letters offer a raw, firsthand account of his own transformation from a relentless persecutor, that's in the book of Acts, to early Christians, into the greatest missionary of the ancient church. Written between 50 and 68 AD, which is why I said Paul was killed in the latter part of the 60s or maybe early 70s. These epistles, all of his epistles together, act as his sort of personal memoir. They trace Paul's history chronologically, even through his letters, revealing his journey from a church planter to a seasoned apostle facing his final days. And sort of his story begins in the book of Acts chapter 9, or Acts chapter 8, actually, where he's there as a witness and even in agreeing and giving the green light to the stoning of Saint Stephen in chapter 8. And you kind of get a glimpse that that watching the stoning of St. Stephen and hearing St. Stephen still confess and still offer forgiveness as the stones are flying, you got a sense that in the very next chapter, as he's on the road to Damascus, something was already stirring in Paul, such that by the time Jesus says, "Why do you persecute me?" that line, "Why do you persecute me?" connects back to the stoning of St. Stephen, as if that's the statement that Jesus knows is going to get Paul to his knees. And sure enough, it does. And he blinds him and so forth. And so Paul's conversion begins there. And I would argue his conversion began when the Holy Spirit was started to work with him after hearing and watching and witnessing the stoning of Stephen. But legitimately, Acts chapter 9, when Jesus appears to him and sends him then to be transformed further in the city there by other Christians who have already converted. So that kind of begins Paul's journey. And then throughout the book of Acts, you get a lot of the work that Paul's doing, sort of things that are said and done by Paul. His writings, earliest writings are 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, where he was writing from Corinth. And these letters show Paul establishing churches among the Gentiles. He consoles the Thessalonians and amid persecution. And so then you have then you sort of turn and you get these sort of missionary journeys that he's on, where he went to the Galatians, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, and then you come the next one in line, sort of in order, is Romans. But Romans is another one written while he's in Corinth, and this is Paul's and Romans, as we're going to learn, is sort of Paul's magnum opus. It's his doctoral dissertation. It reflects a very seasoned theologian. So his first earlier writings, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, you catch a glimpse of his early theology. But if you sort of track it through Galatians and Corinthians, by the time you get to Romans, you can read how Paul's theology has evolved, and it has grown up a bit. There's years between 1st and 2nd Thessalonians and Romans, and his theology and 1st and 2nd Thessalonians was very basic, and by the time he gets to Romans, it's much more involved and much more deep. And then after that, you get some prison epistles where Paul is in prison, and during 60 and 62, he writes the Ephesians, he writes to the Philippians, the Colossians, and Philemon. And then you get the pastoral epistles, lastly, 63 to 67 AD, after his release from his first round of the Roman imprisonment. Paul engaged in some further travels and writing, and he writes through his friends Timothy and Titus. He writes 2 of them to Timothy. And those letters to Timothy and Titus were meant to go to sort of all the churches. So that's different. The writing style is different, and the thrust is different. These are pastoral. Now he's writing to the people in those places about sort of how to manage themselves from a global perspective, whereas Galatians, Corinthians, and even Romans, to a degree, have a sense of specific concerns in those locations, where he's writing specifically to those people. As well as Ephesians, Philippians, those are all written specifically to those churches and those people. So you get kind of a glimpse of that. Now, the earliest sign we get that Paul's letter to the Romans was unique is in the book of Acts. In Acts 18, verses 1 and 2, we get these 2 lines. After this, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth. There he found a Jew named Aquila from Pontus, who had recently come from Italy, Rome, with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius, that's the emperor, had ordered all the Jews to leave Rome. So we know from the book of Acts here, in this couple of verses, when we dig in and mine what is going on here, we know that the church in Rome had, for one thing, it had already been established before Paul is writing. The church in Rome is likely the product of Jewish converts who traveled there from Jerusalem. Remember now, Peter and James and John began the church from Jerusalem outward, and it grew. The centerpiece, the ground zero of Christianity is Jerusalem, and then it grew outwardly. And so many of the Jews who converted, Jerusalem is also a city where you have a lot of travelers in and out. And so many of the Jews who converted left and went to other places. Landing in Rome was a popular place. And so there were always ships coming and going from Rome into places that would land in Jerusalem as well as other places. And so the best speculation is that this church is born out of Jewish converts who went to Rome from Jerusalem, some of the earliest converts, and then they did their own ministry and converted Gentiles who were in Rome. And so you get this Rome is a church that's a collection, almost equally collected, of Gentiles and Jews. And so Paul was not the primary teacher and influencer of the church in Rome. It's more likely it was Peter, James, and John. And so if you understand now Peter's theology that gets fleshed out even a little bit later, Peter's idea was that you had to first be Jewish before you could be Christian. And so these Gentiles and these Jews are working it out together in a number of different ways. But then something happens, and we learn that Emperor Claudius expels all the Jewish people from Rome. And since the Jewish converts were still considering themselves to be Jewish, at least in heritage and in custom and so forth, and culture, these Jewish converts then were expelled from Rome, leaving the Gentiles back, the Gentile converts in to hold down the forts of their church. Now, 5 years pass away, and 5 years later, the Jews were allowed to return to Rome. These Jewish converts returned to Rome. And when they did, the Jewish Christians found that the church had become much more Gentile in custom and practice. And this created division within the two groups, and the church became very fractured and divisive. The Gentiles had a certain way of doing things. The Jews had a certain way of doing things. And so one of the main purposes for Paul to write to the Roman church was to try to unify this group around a common faith that was supposed to then help them see that either Gentiles or Jews, neither of them are so important now. Now we're to unify ourselves around a common faith. So, one faith, one baptism, one Christ was sort of the message. And so that's one of the reasons Paul was writing. He wanted to unify this fractured group of Christians in Rome. The other reason that Paul was writing to the Romans, was because Paul's purpose, secondary purpose at least, for the purpose of the letter, was that he was hoping that the Roman church could become a staging ground for a grander mission that he was imagining. So here you see Rome right up in here. Rome was very metropolitan, right along the sea there, and a lot of commerce, a lot of travel. This was a hub of sorts for ships to travel and come and go, and to travel and to bring all sorts of different people in and out of Rome, going to different places. Paul thought if he could put together a message that summarized, that didn't just unify the church in Rome, but simultaneously could be a statement of theology that was grand enough and written well enough that message, then his writings could then be able to get on a ship with one of those travelers, and he had a vision of his message going all the way over here to Spain. And he wanted to write this letter to the Romans so that what he had would be a declaration of Christian faith for all the world, and so that message would go ahead of him. So that by the time he imagined himself eventually going to Spain, and so he thought he needed his words to go ahead of him. He needed the theology to go ahead of him, to go ahead and plant the church, so that when he came, he would then be able to answer questions and continue to establish the church in Spain. He never made it to Spain. He ended up being captured and ultimately killed. So he never made it to Spain. But his magnus opus, right, his grand statement, written in the Book of Rome, made it all over the world. So it went even further than Spain. So these are the two circumstances that are the motivating factors for Paul to write his fullest explanation of the gospel of Jesus Christ that stands for us today as the Book of Romans. I'm going to pause for a second, see if you have any questions thus far, and then we'll continue some more introductory stuff here. Any thoughts so far? All right. So the letter itself is sort of organized into four main chunks. And there's four, kind of like four movements. And what I've done here is give you there's four parts. It's chapters 1 through 4, chapters 5 through 8, chapters 9 through 11, chapters 12 through 16. Each of those four parts have kind of a different message, but the connective tissue to all four is that they all represent a way in which the gospel works. And so you have, so it's as if the gospel is, and then in chapters 1 through 4, the gospel reveals God's righteousness. And then in chapters 5 through 8, the gospel creates a new humanity. 9 through 11, the gospel fulfills God's promise to Israel. And in 12 to 16, the gospel unifies the church. So Paul was putting together this is a grand design here that he puts together, and he pulls every different sort of literary device that he can into this. Ultimately, what he's doing is he's preparing what sort of comes across as a kind of legal argument, and I'll get into that a little bit further here in just a moment. So a key verse, I think, is in the first section here, Romans 1, 16 to 17. This is sort of like Paul. If you're making a legal argument, you put the statement out front that you're gonna declare this to be the truth. This is the statement, and then everything afterwards is sort of like contributing context to back up your argument. But this is the argument that he's going to make through the rest of the book. He said it's the power of the gospel. He says, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel. It is God's saving power for everyone who believes, for the Jew first and also for the Greek. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed through faith for faith, as it is written, the one who is righteous will live by faith." This is a really, really chock full 2 sentences in the Bible, chock full of stuff. For I am not ashamed of the gospel. Let's just talk about that for a second. Paul obviously isn't ashamed, but in his world, all right, the idea that people would worship a God who was also a man who walked the earth, and that man died and came back to the living, that was something of just unbelievable nonsense to so many people. And quite frankly, to many, an unbeliever is still kind of nonsense today. And so when Paul is putting right up front, I'm not ashamed of this, he's using what in his day would have been sort of a reverse literary device. A lot of orators of his day would say, I am ashamed of, and he would go down the negative path. Paul's flipping what to the ear of the early people, listeners from politicians and so forth, he's flipping it the other way. I am not ashamed. And that doesn't really strike us. We don't live in that context, but from Paul, in Paul's world, they would have heard this sort of like a reverse common phrase. I am not ashamed of the gospel. And then he goes on to make his statement. It is God's saving power. God's saving power for everyone who believes. Notice that there. Look, notice what he's saying there. It's for everyone, Jew or Gentile, or in this case, Jew and Greek. He uses. He puts in this line Jew first, and also for the Greek. Remember, Paul is a Pharisee of the Jewish faith, and he converted. Okay, so he's still, even at Romans, sort of holding to this Jew first idea. But later on, even in the book of Romans, he will sort of counter that with there is nobody, right, who can claim anything of first or last. But here in the first chapter, he's still with that Jew first and then the Greek second. But regardless of the order of things, which he unravels later, regardless of that, this claim that Jews and Gentiles, or Jews and Greeks, are equal to God is unbelievable to that century. It is earth-shattering to those people. All right, they cannot comprehend that. That is total blasphemy on both sides. The Gentile cannot accept the Jew, and a Jew cannot accept the Gentile. And Paul is laying it out there right up front. And then he says, and the reason why is for in it the righteousness of God. Now, if you're a first century person, and especially the Jews, you're used to hearing over and over about the amazing mercy of God through the Old Testament. Anytime you would hear the goodness of God, it was always God is blank. Well, they fill in the blank. That blank is God is merciful. Okay. Righteousness of God is something confined to God. All right. It's not something that we get privy to. It's not something that we have any sort of way in which we can attest any sort of connection to. God's righteousness is left in the clouds. What's given to us is mercy down here on the ground. What Paul is saying would have been earth-shattering. For in it the righteousness. No, he's not saying the mercy of God. He's turning the ear of every Jewish person now to hear something they've never heard before. It's the righteousness of God now revealed through faith, as if it's given to the everyday common person. The righteousness of God given to people who have faith in Jesus. And why would God give righteousness? For faith's sake, not even for the works of things. He's saying that righteousness comes through faith in order to perpetuate faith. That faith itself becomes the power, not the works, and not mercy even. That line is the power that is completely going to change everything from here on out. For in it, the righteousness of God is revealed through faith for the sake of faith. Not for the sake of good works to be done. That is really, really, really over just crazy talk in Paul's time. But it's the foundation of what we Lutherans claim. Justification by faith, not by any works. But here he's laying the groundwork for it. He's going to argue in favor of it later. And then the next part, as it is written, and he pulls back and he quotes the Old Testament. The one who is righteous will live by faith. And he's quoting now something about Genesis. He's going back to Abraham here, right? And that piece will get argued in that third section of Paul's argument here in his opus. He'll make the argument that what God has done is fulfill the promise to Abraham, which is the promise to all the Jews in Jesus. So these couple of lines right in chapter 1 establish a kind of upfront statement that Paul's now going to spend the rest of the letter giving support material to argue his point. This is his point right here, 16 and 17. The rest of it is going to be the way in which he lays an argument to let you support his point. So he's crafting a letter that is very much in the sort of the rhetoric of a legal argument. If you're standing before the court or even before Caesar himself making a legal argument, he's crafting it this way. All right. God's righteousness is given to us. God's mercy is nowhere on the scene. Mercy is seen as sort of something that God does automatically through righteousness by Paul. This is brand new. Salvation for everyone equally? No way. So faith then is trust, not an intellectual belief. And in those days, faith was seen as something you assented to after you were intellectually brought to believe something. Think of some of the ancient writers and philosophers. These are people who believed that if you had the knowledge, you then had access to a greater awareness of the cosmos and so forth. And that belief was Gnosticism. And in Paul's sort of pushing against that with this by talking about faith. So there's so much in there. It's just two verses of the Bible that when you start to dig into those two verses, you see how incredibly powerful it is. So that's where we are. Any thoughts before we go any further?
The only thought I have is that Luther really, really, really relied on Paul for his kind of the background for all of his thoughts. And it seems as if the Catholic Church, as they went on, just ignored Paul.
I can see where you would come up with that, Teresa. I don't think they ignored Paul, but they latched on to the language in the Gospels where Peter is the rock upon which Jesus is going to build his church, and they centered a lot of the theology then around Peter. Paul was still a part of the theological exercise, but I think where Lutherans might lean a little more toward Paul, I think you're picking up on Catholics lean a little bit more towards Peter. But I don't think they were just sort of ignored. I think Peter and Paul need to be wrestled with together from all of us. And to some extent, that's very helpful even for we Lutherans to do in the other direction. And I think over time, Catholics have wrestled with Paul as well on things like justification. Even Catholics now have a doctrine of justification by faith. They just see the merits of the church, still merits of God's grace still working through the church rather than through Christ. So they still align the merits of mercy and the merits of grace with the work of the church as the church is the body of Christ. We Lutherans are not terribly far disconnected from that. And in some respects, I think you could make an argument that we might have gone too far the other way and might need to come back toward the Catholic position to kind of strengthen things. But for whatever case, I think that we still hold fast to some common ground with Catholics today. And while the Reformation split it wide open, we're closer to Catholicism now than I think we've been in 500 years. We're absolutely closer to Catholics than we are to many of the evangelical Christians in America, for sure.
Yeah.
So I think you make a good point. I would just say that in today's world, I think that gap and that wrestling between Paul and Peter has closed a good bit between Catholics and Lutherans. Okay, that's a good point, though. Any other thoughts before we move on here? So again, this is just an introduction. Next week we'll dive into that first chunk of Paul's letters. I just want to give background because I think it's so valuable to kind of understand where Paul is and what he's doing and his purpose for the writing and so forth today. So with our final 10 minutes or so here, I've got some discussion questions. So what do you think? Why do you think people gravitate, well, going back to Teresa's question, gravitate towards Paul in so many ways? Why are the words of Paul and Paul's message, why is it so powerful still today?
When I read Paul, or yeah, I think he puts forth the idea that God is in control, and He's a loving God. It just there's a lot in that book that just makes you feel better, I think.
There's a sovereignty of God that's a
Yeah.
big part of Paul's theology. And while it's not explicit as sort of a theme material, it comes through in everything he does. That's true.
And maybe it's because Paul himself had to found his way, or he didn't find his way, but God found him.
Fair enough. Yeah.
Who, why would he pick Paul?
Yeah.
God saw something.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that the people of Paul's time longed for, beneath the oppression of Caesar, beneath the division between Gentiles and Jews, which also, like in our world, fragments people and families and cultures, all trying to figure out how to live together and, go to the market together and work together. You worked alongside other people that were of different beliefs and so forth, and there was always tension there. We can relate to that in our world. There's divisiveness and tension between people. In our world, it's just between the right and the left. If you're conservative or you're liberal, there's this tension in the room over the things you say and your outlook on the world and what you believe to be right and wrong. Everything sort of, if Paul has a message of good news, it's that Jesus is still greater than that division in an attempt to sort of unify. The good news then is that there is this God who loves both of all these sides equally and wants to unify God's people. Now, can you think of ways in which that would be heard in Paul's time as good news? And can you imagine how it's good news for us? And then if you want to flip it, can you think of some folks who might still hear this as not so good news, right? That we don't want to hear about this good news for all people message. And I would argue, I would say Paul's message in a very politically charged time with the power of the emperor beating down upon him, he was still courageous, but overall the message that he had to share was not a political one. It was very much a religious and faithful message. However, that faith he was proclaiming was one that claimed something that was very countercultural, very counter-political of his day. And it's that God is offering saving grace to all. And that saving grace is the righteousness of God, and it's for all people. So there are folks today who want to keep people divided, want to keep people apart. And to those people who existed in Paul's day, this would have been horrible news. In our world today, you have the left, the right, you also have the wealthy and the not so wealthy. And the gap between those two continues to get wider and wider. It's a little scary these days how rich the rich are getting, while the rest of us seem like we can't get ahead. And that was existing in Paul's time too. And so if you're in the position of power, if you're in a position of influence, if you're in a position of political elitism, Paul's message was not good news, because it was a message in which you're telling me all these people are equal. That means that if I'm going to live into this as an ethic or as a morality, you're asking me who have privilege to give that privilege up, and I'm not going to do that. And so this was not good news for the elite, for the powerful, for the politically powerful, for the financially powerful of Paul's time. Likewise, it has the ability to strike in today's world similarly, but it's not meant to be political. I want to really strongly mention that. It's that the message is not political. but the message strikes people in a way that if you're going to respond, it challenges now where you are in this world. And that challenge is what may be perceived as bad news to a lot of people. So you can imagine, Paul standing before Elon Musk, today, right? I mean, Paul would be writing a pretty strong word to Elon today, right? Pretty strong letter to him. And it would be a letter in which he would offer the grace and peace. He would tell Elon Musk and all of his followers that there is a God who loves them the same way he loves the poor, and that we should all be wrestling with what it means to be one in Christ. Elon has demonstrated he does not want that world to become a reality. And so you see how this is not political, but yet becomes political in the way in which it's lived out. And so Paul then, Paul gets beheaded later on, or at least presumably, we don't really know how Paul died, but it wasn't a public thing. It wasn't like a public execution where people were writing about it. It was done in the hush hush. He was killed. He was executed in some sort of way. And he was executed because of his teaching, because of his belief, because he wouldn't shut up about it and wouldn't stop writing about it. So you can see how there are some people who would believe it's bad news and want to put him out of his misery. But still, the message survived because it really is good news. And here we are 2,000 years ago, still couching and placing an immense amount of our theological foundation on Paul. Let me ask the same question another way. What does it mean when we say the gospel is power?
I will jump in there. In education, we say knowledge is power. And so the gospel is knowledge. And so that gives power. It shows God's power. It shows Jesus's power.
I think that's a nice way to get into it, Michelle. Thanks for bringing up the educational aspect of it. Sure. Yeah. Anybody else have something to offer here? Think about it. What is the gospel? Right? I mean, when we say the gospel, we're not talking about Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John per se. We're talking about the overarching story of God's saving grace for the world through Jesus. And that story of salvation, all right, Paul is claiming that salvation comes to all people. Now, that's in the Gospels as well. But remember, Paul's writing this stuff before the Gospels are written. So Paul's doing his missionary work. Paul's teaching and preaching before Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Mark was probably penned, but Matthew, Luke, and John, no. They were still yet to come. And so if you think about it, right, Paul's laying the groundwork here of letting people know that this righteousness of God is for all people. Now think about that, right? If the righteousness of God is for all people, then Caesar can't tell you what's right and wrong, right? The powers that be of this world can't trump the righteousness of God that has come to you. You know, matters of justice now are being overturned, are being threatened by instead of Caesar's justice, right? Now a Christian is looking at this, sensing a kind of justice from the bottom up. This is grassroots stuff. And so they're able to maintain a sense of justice and a sense of peace and an outlook on the world that is able to defy Caesar and the world around them, even to their death, and nothing stops them. And so what used to be the powers of the government to keep people in place and oppress those that they feel need to be oppressed, and to be able to make money off the backs of slaves and so forth. All of that system now is threatened by this grassroots movement with these Christians who claim the righteousness of God has come to them. Okay, that's powerful. That's very powerful. But it's also powerful in an inward self now, right? Because now instead of looking to the world around me to determine my sense of right and wrong, instead of looking to the government or anybody else to tell me what's expected of me or what I should be doing or how I should be behaving, now this faith in God through this community of believers, as they continue to work it out, now they are forming their own ethic, and they don't need they're now freed from the sense of righteousness of the world that's put upon them. And so when people tell you that you're no good, when people tell you you're too poor, or you're too this, you're not this, or you're not that, the righteousness of God overcomes that from a spiritual sense and encourages people to stand strong in faith in spite of it. So it's this the gospel has power to enliven the soul outward, and then to, as a group, as a collective, to rise up even against tyranny and oppression in its world around us. It's a very grassrootsy kind of movement that's happening. And I would dare say in a political sense, it's a populist movement at the time. It's a very populist movement. You have these leaders like Paul and Peter and so forth, and they're gathering the poorest of the poor. They're gathering the people the world has cast out as sinners and has discarded, gathering them together and empowering them collectively, and letting them know that and then of course you have lots of wealthy folks and people all in between joining the cause. And so the powers that be were really threatened by this. And so the power of the gospel frees the Christian to be servant to all people, and yet slave to no one.
Which is the good news.
It's very good news. It's absolutely good news. Yeah,
Great news.
Yeah, it's very good news. All right. And that's why I'm saying, why would people still today look to the book of Romans to give them this good news? Well, because it's always been there, right? And it's always been there, and it's stood the test of time. And so my next question I wrote down here, why is faith so difficult sometimes that we need then to lean on the words of Paul to prop us up? Why is faith so difficult sometimes?
I guess when we look at the world.
What'd you say, Kathy?
When we look at the world, when you look at the newspaper or
Yeah.
you look at the news, you wonder, and I know I asked the question, why does evil seem to be winning?
Sinful powers that be constantly want to rise up the few to overpower the rest.
Mhm.
Sin has always done it. Since Pharaoh in the biblical story, Pharaoh and then Babylon with Nebuchadnezzar, you name it. The history is filled with tyrannical people who want to gather all the fun, all the money, all the power into one little point so that they can dominate the rest of the world. And God constantly overthrows that from the bottom up. God's message constantly, from freeing the slaves in the Moses story, to bringing the people back from Babylon, to sending Jesus into Bethlehem, being born in Bethlehem, and then for Christ to die to free sinners. All of it has been a Jesus message. You know, the first will be last, the last will be first. All of it is countercultural, because in our world, for all of history, all right, we are surrounded by powers that be that constantly want to centralize power, authority, money, and everything into just a few people, because those people and people sacrifice it too, because they think, oh, well, this is what peace looks like. No, peace does not look like all the power with one person. A kingdom by a person is never peace. It might be for a moment, but that's really not peace. It's the absence of war. And the absence of war is not actually peace. And so Jesus comes on as the Prince of Peace, and the one who frees us comes on the scene to constantly sort of push against that and to free us from it and to free us from sin itself. By dying to it. He says he hangs on his point on the cross basically is saying, this is what the powers of this world do to the innocent. Jesus is innocent, but look at what the powers of this world will do to the innocents. And so it will crush it. It'll destroy it because it can't handle it. So the freedom of the Christian to look upon the cross and be freed from sin is to free us to live into the godly person that God has envisioned for us, and collectively then as the church, then to stand in opposition to these things. Now, again, none of this is political, but to live this way tends to be political. But it's not overtly, Christianity is not a political movement. It's never meant to be. It's a Christian, it's a faith movement, it's a religious movement, but a movement nonetheless that has power. And Paul is sort of the one who's authoring these words to organize that with Rome when he pulls these two sides together, Gentiles and Jews, when he unifies both sides, empowers them now with the faith of Christ. They are then able, and he begins to give them a vision of a kingdom that is greater than the kingdom of Caesar. And that's in the third section we get to imagine you are part of a kingdom, he's pointing out, that's greater than the kingdom of Caesar could ever be. And so these words have always been powerful. The slaves use Romans backwards and forwards as source of inspiration to keep it on in their cause for freedom as well. Civil rights movements and so forth. So this power of the gospel that Paul unleashed with this it's always been there. When the church got a little too aligned with the powers of the world back around the Reformation, and before that, when the church got itself too aligned and became scandalously too close to power, guys like Luther came on the scene and said, no, and they were empowered by Romans. And people before Luther too, only the people before Luther didn't get a whole lot of traction because they didn't have the printing press, and so they ended up getting burned at the stake and so forth. But there were people before Luther who were empowered by the gospel to rise up against the tyranny and the oppressiveness and the scandals that they were seeing in their time. And so this is where Romans sits in our Bible. It's this little powerful writing that Paul could not have imagined having this amount of power and influence over years and years and years to come. So when I say the gospel is power, I mean this is kind of what it means. It frees us. It frees us against the tyranny of this world. And like I was talking with the kids down in Camp Luther, we talked about all the expectations that they live with in this world, from expectations from their parents, from the school system, expectations that the world puts on them to succeed and so forth, and all the different things that are weighing them down. When they realize that God and God's expectations are very different, that God's expectations are simply to love and be loved, and it frees them from all of that, and they can even say no to some of that stuff if they wish, and they can realize that they are free to live into the fullest of the person that God made them to be, and there's no expectation any greater than that. So there's great power in that. All right, I'm preaching a bit. What are your thoughts? Anything else bubbling forward as I'm going on and on?
Well, I think that it's good sometimes that I personally have to go back to Paul's teachings, directly or indirectly, because of all the things that happen in the world. And you say, well, I keep telling myself, God is in control.
Yes.
And sometimes it's hard to see that.
Sure.
But you have to fall back on Paul here a little bit in his teachings.
Yeah, there's a strong message of God's sovereignty in Paul's letter, for sure. The last question I have to go home with here is the power of grace. Paul's message is filled with grace, the theology of justification by grace through faith. How does grace challenge the idea, even the idea externally, that we must earn favor, we must earn love, we must earn the right to have certain place in society, or even for the matter earning God's favor? That is grace, and Paul's message of grace, from your memory, because we haven't studied it yet, challenge that very common notion that's part of our world and the fabric of our society, that there's nothing to earn. How does God's grace challenge that? Well, we're going to study that a bit when we get into that. And grace is the significant power that Paul calls upon. The righteousness of God is given to us by faith, and therefore grace is the thing that abounds for us. So I'll leave you go with that. And going forward then, next week, we're going to study from the 18th verse, because that first 17 verses of Paul's letter are the introduction that he comes to his sort of point that he wants to make. And from verse 18 all the way through the 20th verse of chapter 3, he is he's going to lay the groundwork of the problem of sin, the problem of sin. And then in our third week, we will get to grace and what I like to call the line of God's big but. It's a line in the Bible that begins with but, and from that on out, it's an enormous big but. B-U-T. B-U-T. All right. So next week is the problem of sin. Okay. So that's an introduction into our letter. I hope that this is sitting well with you now, and I hope you want to come back with us next week. We're a little bit over time, so I gotta wrap it up here. I think I've already lost a couple of you. All right. Any thoughts before we go? Okay. I'll see you next time. All right.
Stay safe, Teresa. Thank you.